Good afternoon. This is Kevin Askew, Senior Sales Manager at Programmer's Paradise, and I want to welcome you to today's session number 3 of the free webinar series, Maximizing Data Quality for Value and ROI. Today's session will be Collaborate with Business Stakeholders Using ERwin Templates. Just a brief agenda. I'll just go over briefly who we are. Then I will turn the program over to Victor Rodriguez, who is our database and process modeling consultant. Then after Victor's conclusion, we will have a Q&A session. Programmer's Paradise is a leading e-seller of developer and infrastructure tools. We can be found on the web at www.programmers.com. ERwin falls under our database worldview ecosystem. We are an elite CA partner. They're #1 data modeling reseller in North America. We do have a dedicated CA sales and engineering team focused on database modeling and infrastructure design and training services. We are a leader in delivery of CA education and also an authorized VET and VSA partner. Under our database worldview, we have industry-leading tools for your end-to-end database needs, including database platform, design modeling, development and test, management and administration, deployment and migration, performance monitoring and tuning, and reporting and mining. Today's session, like I said, was session number 3. Please look for information on session number 4, which will be November 17th, which will be leveraging the ERwin API, an introduction and real-life examples. Without going any further, I will turn this over to Victor Rodriguez. Victor?
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks everybody for joining us again. Hopefully you've attended some of our previous webinars, and if not, they're available on demand if you need to view them at any time. The point of this series has been to how do we maximize our data management process so that we can kind of use what we already have now, regardless of what our future implementation is going to be. Are we doing data integration? Are we going to implement some kind of data warehousing? Is this going to be a larger MDM initiative that we're going to be taking effect? Most likely, we already have our data management team in place, a data modeling team in place, I should say. And how do we use that data modeling team to help us facilitate our next step of our actions? And how do we, as data modelers ourselves, how do we promote our importance to the rest of the company? And in this particular topic, we're going to be looking at how can you create templates to maximize the reusability of your design, implement best practices, etc. So the goal of creating templates is to create and share our best practices. By creating a reusable design, we have the consistent look and feel, as well as remove the need to track down enterprise standards. And this also allows us to modify those changes globally. We can have standards across the entire enterprise for validation rules, for RI actions. We can take those processes and the data governance rules that we have, model them within models, and then once we've defined it once, we have that ability to make that a reusable standard across our entire team and ideally across our entire enterprise. So the agenda for today, what are templates? Specifically, I mean, I think we're all familiar with the concept of templates, a reusable template, but what is the concept of the template within the context of the ERwin Enterprise Suite? How do we create them? What are some of the reusable objects and how would we use those? And then we'll have a demonstration at the end showing some simple samples of how you can roll out immediately a template, or use templates, I should say, to roll out some data standardization immediately. So generating templates. There are 2 methods of creating templates. One is using ERwin_TMPL files, and this is simply just if you just have this currently own ERwin or you use it. You can once you've created an ERwin model, just any ERwin model design that you may have that you've derived or created fresh or you opened from the model manager repository, etc. You can simply do the file save as, and you specify the file type as an ERwin_TMPL. Now, once you've created that file in this particular method, what that allows you to do is then to create a new model, and whenever you create a new model, that template file will be available from the list of available templates. We'll probably very frequently have seen when you do a file new, if we've never created any template files, you're always seeing that blank ERwin model as your standard template, or the only template you actually have. But you actually can create as many templates as you'd like for different phases of your process, and then save them so they become reusable, and they will be available on that menu as soon as you create a new model. Second method, if you're using the model manager, is to use the, I'm sorry, I just want to turn on my pointer here, is to use the Save Model as Template option in the Model Manager dialog box itself. And simply, once again, when you go to save your model, you simply turn on that checkbox, and now this becomes a model that becomes reusable for any further implementations you may have, or any time you want to share that design with the rest of your team. So what are these options that we can customize for reusability? From a very high level, we have fonts and colors that we can define. So if you want to have a standard look and feel across the enterprise, for example, we have a small screenshot there to the right where we've customized our foreign keys to always display in red. So now, as soon as you see a table, you notice that this is a foreign key just based on the color of it. So by creating these definitions, you can have a unique look and feel for your project, or have a reusable look and feel across all of your design. Store display settings. You may have very frequently created a new model and then had to define your stored display settings each time. Do you want to show your data types? Do you want to show an FK designation option or not? Do you want to show ungenerated options in one store display and not in another? And we go, oftentimes, becomes a habit that we go and we rebuild these objects over and over and over again, when in reality we can just define it one time, save that into a template file, and then that becomes the starting point for all our processes from that point on. Another very easy way of having a standard look and feel to give your modelers a good overview, a good idea of what needs to be populated to make sure that all those views are populated correctly will allow them to not have to go back to make sure that they've created the standards they need to. And of course, just saves you time in not having a nicely formatted model that you can use over and over again. And thirdly, default subject areas as far as model level objects. You can create subject areas. So you may always have an accounting department, customer, employee, movie. These are the samples from the eMovies model, which comes with the ERwin software. And by defining these categories, once again, we now know that our model is going to have these specific views for the our particular design. Next, model settings. Within the model software itself, or the ERwin software itself, we have the ability to specify diagnostic settings. Where do you want your diagnostics to be generated to? What folders? You also have model manager settings where you may want to bypass difference reconciliation dialogues when there are no conflicts. This is something that many users actually like to see or like to use when they're using the model manager. If you specify this into a template file, this now becomes the standard across the board. So you don't have some people who can make changes to their model, quickly refresh and have those changes saved to the model manager, while other users are finding it more difficult. They're finding they always have to do a difference reconciliation, and they may not be aware of these settings in the model. Once again, we save that into a template file, make that a best practice. Everybody's working off those same the same template, and they're having the same behavior. We want that uniformity behavior. We want to make the tool as easy to use and as quickly to start up as possible. Other model options, we have the activity log generation. You can specify that you want to generate your activity log to a particular file or its particular location on close. This is another option that ERwin allows you to do. All the activities that occurred within your current session are being saved into the action log pane, which we're all should be familiar with in the 7.3 software. But we can actually save that file during the exiting of the tool itself. And beyond that, we can actually specify, let's say, a shared drive for the team. So now at the end of the day, you actually have a location where you can go and audit those changes. So if someone says, there was they're not sure what changes were implemented in their particular session or who made what changes, you now have one location that you can go and see where those changes are. Those changes do not have to be saved to a local location. You can actually put them on a shared drive where everybody can have access to it, and makes it easy for whoever needs to audit that data can have access to it. So these are some of these model level settings, once again, that can be defined, and by having that reusability, we have a more standardized process for everybody. Physical objects, anything that can be created within the ERwin software, any objects that you can create, whether they're entities or physical objects themselves, they're physical representations, we can actually save as reusable objects. Now, why would we need to do this? There may be certain tables that are always being used as part of your application design. You may need to have your employee table in all of your designs. You may need to have certain tables in specific subject areas for your project. Once again, we define that one time. We've already modeled it that one time. We save that into our, as a template file, make that reusable for everybody, and now we're all working off the same page. Very frequently, what we need to use is domains. Probably the most common reusable object across, if anybody who's using ERwin is using having domains that we can specify, and macros themselves. If anybody's used macros in the past, you may have defined rules at the domain level where you may automatically have a table name prefixing your column name, for example. We could define that within the domain rule itself, and then that domain behavior can be saved into a shared file, which now everybody's using the same file, the same template, the same domains for the same projects. And likewise, if you have a central template where everybody's using that, when in the future, if we need to change our validation rules, we need to change the default values, we need to change some part of the business process, we make the modification to the template file, and now we don't have to remind everybody to make that change to all their models. Now when they go and make a change to the, or create a new model or work off a new project, they've already have those changes defined within the template files themselves. Validation rules and defaults, I touched on that briefly, but of course, if you're going to have a reusable validation rule that exists on your server, exists at any part of design level, or if you need to define validation rules, if there's a list of states or a list of a gender or something like that, or valid values of an age range between 20 and 45 or something like that. If we need to have these defined values, we save them one time, we define them as part of the domain, and that adds to the reusability of our design. And we do not need to track down whoever's in charge of the data steward to validate the fact that we have the correct part of this design. It's already part of the template file, so we know from our starting point that we have we're using the correct values. And default values as well. If you have a column that's not allowed to be null, you'll have to specify default on it. But on top of that, oftentimes we have a department code or any value that has a frequent default value. We define that within the template file, make that reusable across the board. So what other physical objects do we expect that we can actually generate within these template files as well? As I mentioned before, we have template tables. These tables, rather than being tables that are reusable, certain parts of design that are always being implemented, rather than that, we're actually talking about a template table. You may have a design where you're always using the same columns within a table. This is frequently the case where, as part of a certain design, you may have a concept of a party, and that party always has certain 3 or 4 or 5 attributes that are always being used. We create a table. We define that table, we put those attributes in there, and we define that table as our template table. Now a user goes and creates a new model, they take that template table, they can copy and paste it within different subject areas within the same model itself, and then add the unique columns or make the modifications they need to make those attributes, or I should say those entities or tables, unique versus their templates. Functions and stored procedures, also something that's very frequently reused, and of course because ERwin actually has its own customizable macro language, we can actually make that even more reusable, where we're not only defining the function, not only defining that stored procedure, but we can make those functions reusable across many tables, regardless of their names, because we can use a macro to define that entity name, for example. And by having that reusability, we now, of course, have the ability to share that. Like all our other objects within template, we want to have as much reusability as possible. So functions and stored procedures are a very, very useful way of defining them, creating reusable objects, and then attaching them to any tables we may need to. And similarly, pre and post scripts. Oftentimes, in the past, for example, many users may be familiar back in 4.1.4, where ERwin didn't have the ability to support grant statements on objects. We actually do have that now in the 7.3 software, but in the past, it was very easy to create a pre or post script, to use the ERwin macros to implement the table name or the column names that were in that table, and then to automatically generate a script file that's going to have the grant statements in it itself. So that's an example of where you could very easily create a pre and post script and attach it to a template file and have that available for everybody. If you need to make a modification to that script at some future time, you make the modification to the template file. Everybody, once again, is using the same standard. And of course, any kind of database-specific objects. You may, for SQL Server, for example, you may have aggregates, partition functions that need to be defined over and over again. These are objects that are going to be used very frequently. Rather than using like some kind of complete compare process where you're comparing objects from one model into another, we just put them into the template file. If it's something we're going to see across the entire enterprise, if it's something that's going to be used across the entire project, or even just within a certain team, we can use the templates to define them, use usable, good names to identify those template files, and then to build off of them with our entire team can build off of the same template files. And of course, if anybody catches any errors, we go and modify the template file itself, and if we can have less production time for correction. Teradata, examples of Teradata database-specific objects are replication groups. Oracle, of course, has many of these database link objects, disk groups, and many other Oracle-specific database objects. Once again, define them, use macros if possible, depending on the type of objects that they are, and make them as reusable as possible. Save them into your template file. Other model customizations are the UDP. User-defined properties can be defined within a template file, and just like we use them in ERwin models every day, we may define new metadata tags that are not currently supported by ERwin. Do we need to have a data steward defined on each one of our columns? Do we have a list of users that we're going to assign as data stewards? Do we want to have different kinds of transforms on columns in a data warehouse implementation? Do we want, if we have a discrete number of them, we can define them as UDPs, create a pull-down list, for example, and specify at the object level which data steward is, which value is going to be assigned to these particular objects. UDPs are defined on almost every single ERwin object, and we can actually define them once again, into a template file and make that as reusable as possible. Default trigger bodies are another example of very reusable objects. ERwin, of course, everybody's familiar with those ERwin-generated triggers. And in the past, oftentimes, we've had requests where users are not happy with ERwin's generated triggers. They want to make some modifications. ERwin allows you to do that. You can customize them at the global level or at the table level and make those modifications to have different behaviors in the tool. And that's something that ERwin supports, but not just at the model level. If we make that modification one time, if we like these new trigger bodies as our defaults, we save that into our template file, and we make that the standard. Other model properties, your model notation. You prefer IE, you may want to make sure that every single model that's generated by a certain team is going to be a data warehouse design. You want to make sure dimensional modeling is the physical design level for those type of models. Once again, we are defining that at the in the template file itself, so we know that across the entire project we're going to be using the same standards. Your RI behavior. And we'll be seeing this when we get into the actual demo, but the RI behavior is another example exactly where we would use, we would specify our customizing our RI, and now how do we make that the standard from that point on? Save it into a template file, and work is done. History settings is another thing that a lot of people think that ERwin may be saving too much history information or maybe too little. Rather than having different users having different amounts of history in all their models, you can actually go into your model level property, say, I do want to know when a new entity is created. I do want to know when a new attribute is created. I do want to know when an object's been created via complete compare or via the API, but I don't necessarily want to see all the other history settings. So by making the modification into a template file, we now make that the starting point from that point on. Another pain point for many ERwin users is the XML option sets for complete compare, for reverse engineering, for forward engineering. And by saving your option sets either as an XML file, a live file out on the server, or saving it into the template file as a part of the model save itself, it becomes a reusable task. So now, if you have defined the complete compare exactly the way you like it, you filtered it down just to those core objects that you need on a day-to-day basis, now share that with the rest of your team, make that part of your template, and make that part of your design. Same thing with reverse engineering. You may not want to see your database link information, for example. You may just want to see your tables, comments, and if you've had that defined already, make that your standard. Forward engineering, very similar there too. What options do you want to see in the script file? You may not want to see everything. You may want to have different behaviors at different times. I want to see forward engineer on the initial when I initialize. Maybe from when I go to do an alter script, I want to see a more limited amount of changes. Have the ability to do that by defining multiple option sets, save them to the template file, and share them with everybody. And of course, reporting. How many times do we have to use the same reports over and over again? You've probably already created those reports. How do you share them with everybody else? If you share that report file into a shared location, have it on a shared server, and save it to the model manager, or save it into the ERwin file or as a model manager, save that as a template file, everybody launching the software is going to have that same standard group of reports as soon as they launch the software. Other options as well, data warehouse standards. Have you already defined a bunch of data sources that are being used for your project? If you already have a bunch of data sources that have been created or imported into a particular model, save that as a template file. And now you'll always have those data sources there. There's no need to go and rebuild them, resynchronize your design with all these external data sources. You've already done it once. It's the only time you only need to do it one time. And of course, data movement rules as well. From the point of view of the data warehousing, you have the ability to define backups or any other kind of data movement rules. Once again, why reinvent the wheel? You've already done it one time. Save that as a template. And mapping behaviors. If you've already created a naming standard file that includes all your glossary definitions and you've created it for one part of the enterprise, if your goal is to build some kind of enterprise level wide behavior as far as mapping your logical to physical names, then if you've done it one time, then that's the only time you really should do it. And you should have one central location where you can go and update that information. And by using a template file, we're always pointing at the same NSM file. We can always update that live NSM file, make the modification, and then it will propagate through to our entire design. We want to have as much reusability as possible. And data type mapping. It's very possible that you may be now using Oracle to SAS as the example I used there, but you may not like these. These are very different types of data types that we're trying to map. ERwin has standard canned mappings, but oftentimes they do not actually represent the type of mapping you have from one design to another. So if you do need to derive a SAS model from an Oracle model, or perhaps you're trying to have an ODBC design that actually is going to represent a Teradata environment or a Netezza environment, something that's not currently supported by ERwin, then you may want to have customized, you may want to create new data types. You may want to map those data types between one design and another, from the logical side to that customized physical model, or from an Oracle design to another type of physical model. Once again, if you do it one time, make that your standard. No one else needs to track you down and say, hey, how did you map that data type? What were you using for that? You have it in your template file. That's what you're using. It's in one place. You know where it is. And other properties, more advanced properties that we want to just kind of cover very quickly. The ODBC query tool, which is new to ERwin 7. for Crystal Reports reporting, if you've designed a really nice report, everybody loves the way it looks, you want to make this a standard report for everybody, but people don't have access to that query. If you've defined it, you have a good result there, share it with everybody. Make that if the template is referencing that object, we can now make that a reusable part of the tool. Forward engineer template files, and we'll show you this, a little bit of this during the demo, but if you've already had someone present you a customized forward engineer template file, maybe support from CA has given you a forward engineer template file that has a fix in it that hasn't currently been implemented in the GA release, or maybe it's a customization, maybe it's syntax that you like better that you've actually done on your own. How do you make that the standard across the entire enterprise? You can easily create a template file, use that forward engineer template file as the file that you're using to generate your SQL, and now save that as a template. As soon as you save that as a template, anybody else who's building a model from that template is going to be already using that forward engineer template file. It's already referenced within the file, and it makes it that much more usable. And volumetrics calculations. If you've customized your volumetrics calculations, you know exactly, or more or less, that this accurately represents the calculations of your physical objects. Why redefine it every time you're modeling? You can just save it one time, save it into the template, and it's reusable. So how do we build these template files? There's a few methods that there's many different ways to create them, but these are probably the ones that I prefer. One is to use a complete compare against a source file. So you could have a model where you have a bunch of domains that you really like to use. You have other options that you'd like to include as well, physical objects or model level properties. You can take a blank model, do a full level compare, just turn the checkbox on at the root level, include everything as part of your complete compare, and import any objects you want. During the complete compare process, you can actually filter based on subject area, based on object type, based on even default font and color settings at object levels. So you have a lot of granularity there, and although sometimes the complete compare can be very overwhelming, this is a perfect example where you want to take full advantage of all of the abilities there within the complete compare. You have a lot of granularity there. You can really filter exactly what objects you want to contain and which you want to ignore. Deleting from a production model. This is probably the most common way that I create them. I actually have a model where I really like to design at the level where it's at. I have a forward engineered template file already customized. I have defined model level objects, defined UDPs. I have the color settings exactly the way I want them. I have a bunch of domains that I've included. So now I can easily just delete objects that I don't want and make sure that I keep everything that I do want, and then just save that as a template file, and there you go. I have a good starting point for my next design. Add a model at a model source. These new features, this design layer features, and I have a webinar on using the design layers, and if you want more information, please do reference that. But ERwin now supports very powerful design layering where you actually can create links from multiple models to each other, create relationships between these. But one of the simplest things you can do from the point of view of design layers is simply to add a model as a model source. So you can actually just take a blank model or an existing model, add a model as a source, and then there's going to be, ERwin's going to maintain a relationship between those objects. It's going to create that as a model source, and it's going to actually import all the objects that are in that model source. So if you already have a good starting point model, you want to add that as a model source, all those objects are going to be imported, save that file as a template file. And then there's also, from the point of view of design layering, we have the ability to derive new models and to split models. So if you already have a production model, you're at a good starting point with your design, you can actually split just the physical model off from a logical physical design or a logical only model, depending on what kind of template you may need. You can, and then once you have those models defined, you can now do a file save as, and just save it as an ERwin_TMPL file or into your model manager repository. And we're going to do a quick demonstration now. Just bear with me for one moment. And hopefully you can see my desktop. I'm going to open a model from, or rather, we're going to use a template file. So I'm going to do a file new model. I'm going to use a logical physical design. these are templates that I've previously defined that we see that are available here, but I'm actually going to use my model manager. Just click on this Browse ERwin Model Manager option. And I'm going to use this AdventureWorks Dev template. So I'm going to open this model. So what you see here is we've already, so this is my starting point. So I have a subject area defined. I have different tabs already here. But most importantly, I have physical objects. So I have my certificates that I've previously defined. I have database roles that have been previously defined. I have databases that have been previously defined. Domains that have been previously defined. And tables. Now, if I want to click from my logical design to my physical design, I just click on my logical tab. I go to my physical, my definition tab. So let's do a simple design here. We'll take employee, which I'm just going to drag and drop right into my design area here, and my department. And let's see employee department history. That seems like these are all related tables. And we see I have a so I've quickly created a design. Now I'm seeing my definition of the objects because I'm actually in my definition tab. I can go to the physical tab, and here is my physical design. I can rearrange my relationships a little bit. If I go to my physical all, we'll see that there's a lot more information here. I actually have these constraint names, RI actions. So we're seeing a lot more design here, but we've already defined these previously, which makes us, gives us much quicker starting point for our design. So we see that we've quickly designed a simple model here, and we're using existing objects. We're formatting them the way we want to. The red text shows us that these are our foreign key objects. So we've saved ourselves a lot of time by having these predefined objects. Now let's take a look at the domain here. And I have a domain called phone that I've defined previously. And I'm going to drop this phone column right into the employee table. And by, this actually should be expanding. I'm not sure why that didn't expand correctly this time. But what this allows us to do is to create this domain into our table. And how about this one? Is this one working? There we go. That one worked correctly. So I also created like a web service ID. I'm going to have a unique ID for each one of these tables. And I'm actually going to, I'm using a macro here to define the code within it. So if I actually just drag it into the department, we'll see that it becomes a department UID. If I drag it into employee, it's going to become employee UID. And we can do the same thing for employee department. Now we're doing this because we're using macros within the definition of the column itself. We're using a %owner entity _ UID. So once again, by using the macros, by defining a domain, we are creating reusable design. Now for the next demonstration, I'm going to use a data warehouse sample. And now this is also going to be a SQL Server design. Now this particular design here, similar to what we saw before, we have different design levels. We already have defined subject areas. We've already defined stored display settings. So let's start to build our design. So we're going to have call. This is our fact table. And we've already specified a stored display to have a collapsed facts table, to have an expanded facts table, and this is just a column design here. And we can start building our design here. So we have call reason, customer, let's move these columns around a little, relationships, time, for example. And once again, we go to fact details. We could rearrange these and move around these relationship lines. Or dimension detail, and here we go, our fact table, and we have our dimensions. And similar to what we saw before, we actually have the ability now to have the quickly just drag and drop. We're creating a design. We have colors that are already been predefined. We have behaviors that have already been predefined, and we have stored display levels that have already been defined. So we have a look and feel that can be shared across all of our users. And of course, because this is a dimensional model, we have dimensional rules or data movement rules that have been previously created. Here's our backup rule, for example. We have data sources that have already been created. If we go into our columns, we see that we already have predefined all of our data sources for this design. So if we need to add any information from here, we've already previously established it. So once again, having that reusability, the ability to use that design over and over again. So let's go back to our slideshow. So one last point I'd like to look at is what are the advantages of using the model manager for all this implementation. As I kind of touched on previously, we have the ability to have a central repository for that collaboration. So we have the ability to use that to have one central location. Oftentimes you have a model, and we've all experienced this. You have an ERwin model, you mail it to one of your users, to one of your teammates, and when they go to launch the software, there's a lookup file that was referenced by a domain that is no longer attached. There is a, the report files are not available. The NSM files that you're using were not included. So you either have the problem is that the model is pointing at, with an ERwin file, you're always pointing at one physical location. It's an explicit path to a particular file, to a specific XML file, to a particular CSV file, etc. So how do we make that reusable? By having the model manager, it's twofold. Some of the objects are actually being stored into the repository, the NSM file, for example, or the model properties. Rather than using the XML file to have your complete compare options, you're actually going to be saving that as part of the model itself. So now that you're saving that right into the repository, there's no need to send more files. You actually have it all within the repository. Some files are actually externalized, like your reporting files. If you're actually specifically ran some reports and you have actual result sets, they're pointing at a physical location. However, you can create a shared location, a shared drive where those files are stored, and then once again, you launch it from the model manager. You're pointing at that one specific physical shared drive, so there's no reason, once again, to tell everybody, oh, you have to map to this location, or you have to include this, that, and the other thing. It's already in one location. It's all defined in one location, even for externalized files. And deriving models. If you derive a model and then you send it to another user and they try to synchronize back, of course, you did not send them the parent model. You sent them only the derived model. So that linkage is no longer valid. You use the model manager. the parent model is in the repository, the child model is in the repository. That linkage, that lineage is easy to define and to see. So just to wrap it up, using templates allow you data modelers to define and share their business process rules and their best practices. That's going to save you a lot of time. It's going to prevent a lot of mistakes, and it's going to allow you to create a better process from beginning to end so you know exactly where you are in your design process. Templates allow you to reduce the time spent on design, reuse your previous best efforts, and recycle objects from previous designs. And using the Model Manager repository allows you a collaborative space that allows everybody to have a central location to access, update, synchronize their designs. If you need to make modifications to your NSM files, etc., you have one location where you've made the changes, and they become the global standard from that point on. And for that, with that, I should say, we're going to have some question and answers. If there are any, please feel free to ask anything you might.
Thanks, Victor. We actually do have a question right now, and if anybody else does have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we will have Victor answer them for us. All right. The first one is, how would ERwin help with documenting enterprise standards and business rules?
ERwin does not actually have a repository, like a method of defining these into, as part of the ERwin behavior itself. However, your business process rules are being defined, or actually I should say they actually are enforcing data rules. So for example, you're looking at defining your RI is a business process rule. Defining your cardinality is a business process rule. So when you get that spreadsheet with all of those business processes that have to be valid, be defined, you can actually define those within your model. You can actually create a list of validation rules. You can actually build a list of or I should say, you should define those RI actions and then make that your template, and then that becomes your standard. So each one of those line items of for your data governance rules can be modeled within the ERwin modeler itself, and then of course so in that way you are implementing those data governance rules, those business process rules.
Okay. We have another one here. We have many team members and models from many ERwin versions, and they do not use any templates. How do we rebuild all those models using template models, or would we need to start over?
You wouldn't need to start over. What you could do is you could actually, one of the methods I mentioned is you can actually add a model as a data source, or I should say as a model source. So you can actually take an existing model, add one of your previous design models as your model source, and then you're importing all of those, the options that you've just defined, all those business process rules, those RI actions, validation rules, etc., are being imported. For the most part, if there is overlapping design, if there's tables, domains, etc., they will merge during that when you add that model source. So when you're creating that, or you can also link, and once again, check my previous webinar on using design layers. You can link your existing model to a template file or a model that you've already defined that have your best practices, and then once you create that relationship, now the behavior will be similar, where you now can say, okay, I need to synchronize with my template model, that source model that you've defined, and by using the design layers, ERwin will actually maintain those relationships, allow you to do synchronization in both directions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Victor. If anybody else has any more questions, feel free to keep typing them in. We're just going to wrap this up, but if you do have any other questions, go ahead and type them in and we'll get them answered for you.
Okay, not seeing any more questions. If you need to get some more information on ERwin, whether it be for a free data quality assessment, software services, product upgrades, data quality process engagements, or training, you can email our ERwin team at ca.erwin@programmers.com or visit us on the web at www.programmers.com/ca. Our webinars and webinars on demand are listed also at that same website, programmers.com/ca. You can also visit Victor's blog at maximumdatamodeling.blogspot.com, or on Twitter at Max Data Modeling. Also visiting Victor on LinkedIn at Maximum Data Modeling. So if there are no more questions, we'd like to thank you for attending session number 3, and we look forward to session number 4 on November 17th. Thank you.